The first time I realized my son was planning to destroy me, he was sitting at my kitchen table, drumming his fingers on the polished oak my husband had spent a month restoring. It was 2 weeks after we'd buried David, my husband of 42 years, and the grief was still a physical weight, a shroud I couldn't seem to shrug off. Oliver was talking, his voice a smooth, concerned murmur that had always reminded me of sand slipping through an hourglass, time running out. "Mum, you shouldn't be alone in this big house," he said, his eyes scanning the room not with nostalgia, but with the cool appraisal of an estate agent. "What if you fell? What if something happened?" I turned from the sink, my hands still soapy from washing yet another casserole dish brought by a well-meaning neighbor. "I've managed for 67 years, Oliver. I think I can handle a few more." But he was relentless. He and his wife, Chloe, began a campaign of quiet terror, waged over cups of tea and Sunday lunches. Every conversation was a carefully planted seed of doubt. Chloe would mention a story she'd read online about an elderly woman found days after a fall. Oliver would talk about rising damp, dodgy wiring, the sheer cost of maintaining a place this size. They painted such a vivid picture of my impending doom that I almost started to believe it myself. They weren't offering comfort, they were selling a coffin. The real reason for their sudden, suffocating concern became clear 3 months after the funeral. I was in the garden, trying to tame the roses David had loved so much, when they arrived unannounced. They exchanged that look, the one married couples use when they think they're being clever. "Mum," Oliver began, using his salesman voice, the one that could sell ice to Eskimos and doubt to a saint. "Property values around here have skyrocketed. You could make a killing. Move somewhere smaller, more manageable." "And where would that be?" I asked, my trowel digging into the damp soil. "Well," Chloe chimed in, her smile as bright and brittle as spun sugar, "we've got the spare room. You could stay with us, just until you find your feet." There it was, the hook baited and thrown. They didn't want me to find my feet. They wanted to cut them off at the ankles. They wanted my house, my savings, my independence. They wanted me to become their personal pension plan, a live-in cash machine until I was no longer useful, at which point I'd be quietly deposited in the cheapest care home they could find. The old Eleanor, the one who existed before David's heart gave out, would have politely refused. She would have changed the subject. But grief had forged something harder in me. Grief and the sudden, chilling clarity of seeing my own child for what he truly was. Have you ever looked at someone you love and seen a stranger looking back? It's a cold, lonely feeling. Tell me in the comments if you know what I'm talking about. The universe, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. That October, carrying a bag of groceries up the porch steps, my foot slipped on a wet leaf. I went down hard. Nothing broken, just a bruised hip and a nasty scrape, but I was shaken. Oliver found me there, surrounded by scattered tins and a carton of spilled milk. His first words weren't, "Are you all right, Mum?" They were, "This is exactly what we were talking about." He helped me inside, made me tea, fussed over me with a performance of filial duty that was almost convincing. For a moment, a foolish, hopeful moment, I thought I'd misjudged him. Then Chloe arrived. She swept through my home like a storm front, her eyes cataloging every flaw. A dripping tap, dust bunnies under the sofa, a water stain on the bathroom ceiling. She wasn't seeing a home, she was assessing a property and finding it wanting. "This is a sign, Ollie," she announced, as if I wasn't even in the room. "She needs to be with us before something really bad happens." And in that moment, I understood. They weren't waiting for me to agree. They were waiting for me to become so broken, so desperate that I would have no other choice. They wanted me to run to them for safety. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I would walk willingly into the trap. Because the thing about being 67 is that everyone assumes you're either helpless or invisible. I am neither, and I was about to use their low expectations as my greatest weapon. I let them think they'd won. I packed a small suitcase with what Chloe called my essentials: my clothes, my medication, a few photographs. The rest of my life, the 42 years of memories packed into that house, would stay behind. The spare room was her craft room, hastily cleared. A fold-out table was pushed against the wall, and a sickly sweet vanilla candle did little to mask the smell of stale potpourri. "It's not much," Chloe said, leaning against the door frame, all false sympathy. "It's fine, dear," I said, my voice steady. I folded the last jumper David ever wore and placed it in a drawer. "Thank you for making room for me." The first week was a masterclass in manipulation. Chloe cooked elaborate meals from recipes she'd found on Instagram, positioning me in photos for her friends to see what a wonderful, caring daughter-in-law she was. Oliver brought me coffee in bed, asking how I'd slept in that lumpy, narrow cot. They were playing a part, and I, in turn, played mine. I was the grateful, slightly confused widow, a refugee in their perfect suburban home. But a performance like that can only last so long. By the second week, the mask began to slip. Heavy sighs when Chloe had to move her sewing box. Tense, whispered arguments in the kitchen that silent the moment I entered. The house was full of their things, their life, their rules. And I was about to find out just how little space there was for me. The rules started in the third week. It began with the main bathroom, which I was politely asked not to use during peak hours. Then it was the living room television, which was reserved for their relaxation time after work. Soon, even the kitchen became a minefield of unspoken regulations. Each new rule was delivered in Oliver's calm, reasonable tone, making me feel like the difficult one for even questioning it. They weren't just making me a guest in their home, they were making me a prisoner. And I let them. I smiled, I nodded, I thanked them for their consideration. Because I wasn't just their prisoner, I was their judge, their jury, and I was quietly building the case against them, one small humiliation at a time. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have fought back then and there, or played the long game? The physical intimidation started small, as it always does. A hand on my shoulder, pressing just a little too hard. An elbow gripped a fraction too tight as Oliver helped me down the stairs. Tiny acts of aggression disguised as care, each one designed to leave me feeling off balance and apologetic for simply existing in their space. I was learning that my son and his wife weren't just selfish, they were bullies. And they thought they'd found the perfect victim, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was a nurse for 30 years. I know how to stay calm in a crisis. And I know better than anyone how to document the symptoms of a sickness. And their particular sickness, their greed, their cruelty, was about to be recorded for all the world to see. The day I moved into my son's house felt less like a homecoming and more like a surrender. Oliver carried my single suitcase upstairs to what Chloe cheerily called the guest suite. It was her craft room, hastily tidied. A fold-out sewing table was pressed against one wall, plastic tubs of fabric were stacked in the wardrobe, and the air was thick with the sickly sweet scent of a vanilla-scented candle that failed to mask a cloying undernote of potpourri. It was the smell of a room that didn't want to be lived in. "I know it's not much," Chloe said, leaning in the doorway. Her smile was a masterpiece of forced sympathy, a perfect, bright curve that held no warmth whatsoever. "But it's just temporary, isn't it? Just until we find you something perfect." I looked at the narrow camp bed with its thin polyester duvet. Perfect was not the word that came to mind. I managed a weak smile of my own. "It's lovely, dear. Thank you for making room for me. I was an actress now, and this was my stage." The first week was a meticulously choreographed performance for an audience of one, me, and of course for Chloe's Instagram followers. She cooked meals that were more about aesthetics than flavor, arranging jewel-bright vegetables around a piece of pale, overcooked chicken. Before I could take a bite, her phone would be out, capturing the scene. I could almost read the captions in my head. "So lovely having my dear mother-in-law with us, making sure she's eating well. Hashtag family first, caring for our elders." Oliver played his part with equal dedication. He would bring me a cup of weak tea in the mornings, his hand patting my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a brand than a comfort. He'd ask how I'd slept, his voice dripping with a concern so synthetic it was almost insulting. They weren't caring for me, they were managing an asset, and they wanted me to know my place. I let them. I ate the bland food, drank the weak tea, and offered up my most convincing performance of a grateful, slightly bewildered old woman. I was a ghost at their table, a shadow in their hallway. They thought my silence was submission. They had no idea it was observation. By the second week, the strain of the performance began to show. The smiles became brittle, the concern frayed at the edges. It started with the sighs, a deep, put-up exhalation from Chloe whenever she had to move one of her craft boxes to let me get to the wardrobe. A quiet, tense hiss of air through Oliver's teeth when I asked him to turn the volume up on the television. Have you ever been made to feel like an inconvenience in your own life? It's a uniquely soul-destroying experience. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt that slow, creeping chill of being unwelcome. The whispers started soon after. They'd stand in the kitchen, their heads close together, voices low and urgent. The moment I entered the room, they'd fall silent, turning to me with bright, false smiles that never reached their cold, calculating eyes. The atmosphere in that house grew heavy, charged with a resentment so thick I could taste it. Then, in the third week, the rules began. They were introduced not as commands, but as gentle, reasonable suggestions for the harmony of the household. The first was the main bathroom. Oliver explained, in that patient, patronizing tone he'd perfected, that it would be better if I used the small downstairs voo during peak hours. That meant the entire morning and most of the evening. The downstairs loo was a cramped, windowless cupboard under the stairs with a dodgy flush and a permanent smell of damp. I smiled my vacant, agreeable smile and said it sounded perfectly sensible. Next, the living room was declared off-limits after 7 p.m. That was their time, Oliver explained, to unwind and relax. I was welcome to watch the small television in my room, provided the volume was kept to a minimum so as not to disturb them. My world, which had already shrunk from a house to a room, was now shrinking even further. The final frontier was the kitchen. My presence there was treated as a major disruption to Chloe's system. Every cup I used, every plate I touched, had to be washed, dried, and put away the instant I was finished with it. She would watch me, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of tight-lipped disapproval, making me feel like a clumsy child. Each new rule was another bar on the cage they were so carefully constructing around me. I accepted every single one without complaint. They thought they were domesticating me, breaking my spirit with 1,000 tiny cuts. They couldn't see that with every new restriction, my resolve hardened. My son and his wife were not just selfish, they were bullies. And I was gathering my evidence. The subtle physical intimidation began then, too. It was deniable, of course.
a hand on my shoulder, pressing just a little too hard to guide me out of the way, Oliver's grip on my elbow as he helped me down a single step, his fingers digging in just enough to be a warning. They were testing my boundaries, seeing how far they could push before I broke. What would you have done? Would you have screamed, fought back, and been labeled hysterical and confused? Or would you have done what I did? I endured. I absorbed the pressure, the insults, the quiet, creeping cruelty. I was a seismograph, recording every tremor of their malice. Because I knew a breaking point was coming, I just had to make sure that when it came, it was theirs, not mine. The night I heard everything, I was in my room, the door slightly ajar, pretending to be asleep. The walls in that cheap new build were paper-thin, an architectural flaw that was about to become my greatest advantage. Their voices drifted down the hallway from their bedroom, sharp and clear in the quiet house.
"She's not even that old," Chloe's voice dripped with contempt. "My gran is 93 and still lives on her own. Your mom is just dramatic because your dad babied her his whole life." A low murmur from Oliver, then his voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Give it time. She'll get more dependent as she settles in. Then we can start talking about power of attorney, financial management." He paused, and his next words landed like stones on my heart. For her own protection, of course. There it was, the entire rotten plan laid bare in the darkness. Not just my house, not just my savings. They wanted my life. They wanted to erase me, to turn me into a legal non-entity, a signature on a form, while they bled me dry. Lying in that narrow, uncomfortable bed, a profound and terrible stillness came over me. The grief I felt for the son I thought I had raised vanished, burned away by a feeling so cold and pure it was almost peaceful. It was the feeling of absolute, unshakable certainty. My son was my enemy, and the war had just begun. Configuration. I didn't sleep that night. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, the cheap duvet a leaden weight on my chest, and listened to the sound of my son sleeping in the next room. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the man whose wedding speech had made me weep with pride. That person was gone, replaced by a cold-eyed stranger who was calmly, methodically planning my destruction. The grief I felt in that moment was sharper and more profound than the grief I'd felt for my husband, because this was the death of the living. The next morning, I rose and put on my mask. I became Eleanor Thompson, the slightly confused, grieving widow once more. I shuffled into the kitchen, my movements deliberately slow, my eyes carefully unfocused. I thanked Chloe for the piece of burnt toast she slid onto a plate in front of me, and I smiled vaguely as Oliver reminded me for the third time that it was Tuesday. They saw a frail old woman, a problem to be managed, a mind beginning to fray. They had no idea they were looking at their executioner. Their arrogance was my camouflage, their condescension my shield. I was a ghost in their machine, and they were too busy admiring their own reflection to ever see me. What does it take, I wonder, to make a mother become a spy in her own son's house? Tell me, what would you do if the person you trusted most in the world turned out to be your greatest threat? That afternoon, I announced I had a routine checkup with my GP. It was a lie, of course, but a plausible one, rooted in their narrative of my declining health.
Oliver, ever the dutiful son, immediately offered to drive me. "You shouldn't be going all that way on your own, Mom." I waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of gentle stubbornness I had perfected. "Nonsense, dear. The walk will do me good. A bit of fresh air." He relented, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. My small act of independence was a flaw in their carefully managed script. My real destination was an electronics shop in the high street, tucked between a betting shop and a vape store. It was a world of flashing lights and loud music, and I, in my beige raincoat and sensible shoes, must have looked like a creature from another planet. The young man who approached me had kind eyes, a pierced eyebrow, and more tattoos than I could count. He didn't treat me like I was invisible or incompetent. He just asked how he could help. I spun him a simple, believable story. I told him I wanted to record some family memories, stories for the grandchildren I would likely never have now. I needed something small, discreet, and easy to use. He listened patiently, then showed me a digital recorder disguised as a sleek black fountain pen. It was perfect. Then he pointed to a tiny camera, no bigger than a button on my cardigan. "This one's great for capturing expressions," he said.
Finally, he showed me how to set up the software, a simple app on my phone that would automatically, wirelessly, back up every recording to a secure cloud server, a digital vault they would never find. "Doing a bit of investigative work?" he asked with a knowing wink as I paid in cash. I gave him a small, sad smile. "Something like that," I said. I walked out of that shop with a carrier bag that felt heavier than it had any right to be. It didn't just contain electronics, it contained my future. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the inevitable. I was an investigator, and I was building my case. Back in my room, the door locked, I laid out my new arsenal on the thin duvet. The quiet, satisfying click of the pen as I activated the recorder. The tiny, winking lens of the camera. These were not tools of betrayal, they were instruments of truth. For 30 years as a nurse, I had documented symptoms, recorded observations, and built a body of evidence to diagnose an illness. This was no different. I was simply diagnosing the sickness in my own family. I ran a test. I switched on the pen and left it on my bedside table, nestled amongst my pill bottles. I walked down the hall to the bathroom, humming an old tune David used to love, the sound deliberately shaky. When I returned, I locked the door, put in my headphones, and played it back. The recording was crystal clear. My humming was there, a perfect performance of elderly fragility. But so was the sound of Chloe in the living room, her voice sharp and annoyed, as she complained to a friend on the phone about how much I was under her feet, about how she couldn't wait for this whole thing to be over. A cold thrill went through me. It worked. It actually worked. Have you ever had a moment where a desperate, crazy plan suddenly feels entirely possible? It's a terrifying and exhilarating feeling. The next day, my new life began. The pen recorder was tucked into the pocket of my cardigan. The button camera was pinned to the lapel, a silent, unblinking eye. I sat with them at the dinner table, a ghost in my own life, as they talked over me and around me, discussing my future as if I were a piece of furniture to be disposed of. Living that lie was the hardest thing I have ever done. I had to swallow the acid of my anger, bite back the truth that burned on my tongue, and present a mask of docile confusion while my heart hammered against my ribs with a cold, clear, righteous fury. I had to listen to my son talk about the best way to manage my assets, all while he passed me the salt. They thought they were in control. They saw themselves as the predators circling their helpless prey.
They were so blinded by their own greed, they couldn't see the truth. The prey had become the hunter. Every condescending word, every veiled threat, every sigh of impatience was now being captured, catalogued, and stored. They thought they were writing my final chapter. They had no idea they were just dictating their own confessions. Every word they spoke was a nail in their own coffin, and I was the one holding the hammer. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of feigned fragility and silent surveillance. My life became a performance. I would spend my mornings sitting in the armchair by the window, a book open on my lap, my eyes staring blankly at the page. I was playing the part of a woman fading into obscurity, while every nerve in my body was alight, listening, watching, recording. At night, I would lock my door and the real work would begin. With my small headphones pressed tight against my ears, I would listen back to the day's recordings. It was a form of self-torture, hearing the unfiltered truth of their feelings for me. I heard Chloe on the phone to her sister, complaining about the extra cost of the weekly shop since I'd arrived. Honestly, she'd sighed, her voice a poison dart. It's like running a bloody retirement home, and the smell of her lavender soap is everywhere. I heard my own son, my Oliver, laughing with a friend about my senior moments. He recounted a story where I'd misplaced my reading glasses, which he had moved, and described my mild panic with a detached, cruel amusement. "She's losing it, mate," he'd said, the sound of his laughter making my stomach clench. "It's actually quite sad. We're going to have to step in soon for her own good." Each recording was a fresh wound. The son I had loved was a phantom, a memory. The man whose voice I now heard discussing my fabricated mental decline was a monster wearing his face. Have you ever had to mourn someone who is still alive? It is a special kind of hell, a grief with no end and no closure. The psychological toll was immense. I had to sit at the dinner table and smile at the woman who had just called me a burden. I had to accept a cup of tea from the man who was actively plotting to have me declared mentally incompetent. My training as a nurse was the only thing that got me through. I treated myself as a long-term undercover case. Observe, document, do not engage. Do not let the subject know they are being watched. By the time the first week of November had passed, I had over 30 hours of recordings, a library of their contempt, a catalogue of their greed. But a terrifying thought began to take root. What if it wasn't enough? They were already building a narrative of my confusion and paranoia. Who would a court believe? A successful, charming salesman and his respectable wife, or a confused old woman with a collection of secret recordings? They could claim I had doctored them, that I had imagined it all. I realized I needed more than just evidence. I needed an anchor in the real world. I needed a credible, professional witness who could testify to my state of mind before the crisis hit. I needed someone whose word would stand against theirs. I needed my doctor. Dr. Sharma had been my GP for 15 years. She had treated me for bronchitis, managed my blood pressure, and most importantly, she had been David's doctor during his final, difficult months. She knew me, she knew my history, and I prayed she would believe me. Making the appointment was a risk. I told Oliver and Chloe it was for a routine prescription renewal. Chloe had immediately offered to come with me. "To help you remember what the doctor says, dear," she'd said, her voice oozing false concern. The thought of her sitting in that consulting room, a smug, silent threat, made my blood run cold.
I refused, inventing a story about needing a private woman's chat with the doctor. The look she gave me was sharp with suspicion, but she didn't push it. I sat in the surgery waiting room, my hands clenched in my lap, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What if she didn't believe me? What if she saw exactly what my son wanted her to see? A paranoid old woman, lost in grief, making up stories? When she called my name, my legs felt unsteady as I walked into her office. I didn't weep or rage. I presented my case as calmly and methodically as if I were handing over a patient's chart. I told her about the pressure, the isolation, the subtle but escalating psychological abuse. I told her I was keeping a detailed diary of events because I was afraid. Afraid of what, Eleanor? She asked, her eyes full of a gentle, professional concern. I'm afraid of what will happen if they realize I'm not the confused, helpless woman they think I am, I said, my voice low but steady. She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving my face. She had seen me at my lowest, in the depths of my grief after David died. She knew the difference between grief and delusion. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she leans forward. "I believe you," she said. The relief was so profound, it almost broke me. It was then that I proposed my plan. I asked her, as my doctor, if she would be willing to be my safety net. We agreed on a simple 4-word text message. Emergency plan active now. If she ever received that text from my phone, she would not try to call me back. She would immediately call 999, request a police welfare check at Oliver's address on the grounds of suspected elder abuse, and then she would drive there herself to act as a medical witness. "You are a very resourceful woman, Eleanor," she said, writing down the protocol in my file. She was documenting my competence even as we spoke. I left her surgery feeling as though a great weight had been lifted. I finally had an ally. My plan was no longer just a desperate gamble. It had a foundation. But as I walked home, the cold November air sharp in my lungs, a new, chilling thought settled over me. Dr. Sharma was my safety net in a crisis. She could verify my sanity and call for help, but she couldn't fight a legal battle. They were planning to take everything from me, using the law as their weapon, power of attorney, financial guardianship. They would twist the system to their own ends. I realized then that a doctor wasn't enough. I needed a weapon of my own. I needed a solicitor. Finding a solicitor felt like an act of defiance. It was the first concrete step I had taken not just to defend myself, but to fight back. I couldn't just walk into a local firm. Oliver and Chloe had friends everywhere, and the last thing I needed was for word to get back to them that I was seeking legal advice. So I did my research quietly, in the dead of night, using the small tablet I kept hidden under my mattress. I looked for a specialist, someone who understood the dark, murky world of elder law, financial abuse, and family disputes. I found him in a firm based in the city, an hour away by train. His name was Marcus Carter, and his online profile described him as a tenacious advocate for vulnerable adults. His face, in the small professional headshot, was sharp and intelligent, and he looked like a man who did not suffer fools gladly. He was exactly what I needed. Getting to his office was a logistical nightmare. I had to invent another plausible excuse, this time a long overdue catch-up with an old nursing colleague who had moved to London. Chloe's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Which colleague?" she'd asked, her tone casual, but her gaze sharp as a needle. I plucked a name from my past, a woman I knew she'd never met, and prayed she wouldn't try to verify my story. The train journey to London felt like escaping into another world. For a few hours, I wasn't a prisoner in my son's house.
I was just another anonymous woman on her way to an appointment. Mr. Carter's office was in a tall glass building that seemed to disappear into the gray November sky. It was intimidating, but as I sat in the plush leather chair opposite his desk, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was real. This was happening. I didn't tell him the whole story at first. I started cautiously, presenting a hypothetical scenario. I spoke of an elderly widow, a concerned son, and a growing unease about financial matters. He listened, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. He had heard variations of this story 100 times before. "Mrs. Thompson," he said finally, his voice calm and direct, "hypotheticals are a waste of both my time and your money. Why don't you tell me what's really happening?" So I did. I told him everything. The pressure to sell my home, the move, the rules, the psychological warfare. And then I took out the pen recorder from my handbag and placed it on his polished desk. "And for the past 3 weeks," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I have been recording them." For the first time, his professional mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, respect, perhaps even a little alarm. He leaned forward. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the pen. I nodded. He spent the next 20 minutes listening through his headphones, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't listen to all 30 hours, of course, but he sampled enough, fast-forwarding, pausing, his expression growing grimmer with every passing minute. When he finally took the headphones off, he looked at me with new eyes. "My God," he said softly, "they're building a case to have you declared legally incompetent. This is premeditated. This is a conspiracy." Hearing him say it, hearing the cold, legal terminology for their betrayal, made it terrifyingly real. It wasn't just my imagination. I wasn't being paranoid. I was in danger. From that moment on, he was my ally, my strategist. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a plan. He explained that the recordings were my bombshell, but we needed to handle them carefully. He would act as a secure, independent third party. I would continue to upload my evidence to the cloud server, and I would give him exclusive access. He would catalog every file, every photograph of the bruises that were beginning to appear from their rough handling, every new restrictive rule they imposed. We set up a second emergency protocol, a mirror of the one I had with Dr. Sharma. I would send his office a simple, coded message, "Documentation package required," and that would trigger him to send the entire, meticulously organized file of evidence to the police, to Adult Protective Services, and to the local council. He was building a legal fortress around me, brick by digital brick. "The key, Eleanor," he said, calling me by my first name for the first time, "is to continue as you are. You are their perfect victim, helpless, confused, compliant. Do not let them see the woman who is sitting in my office right now. The moment they suspect you are anything other than what they believe you to be, they will escalate, and it could become dangerous." I left his office with a new sense of purpose. I was no longer just a survivor, gathering evidence in secret. I was a client. I had a solicitor. I had a plan. I had a team. Have you ever felt that shift, that moment when you stop being a victim and start being a fighter? It's like being able to breathe again after holding your breath for a very, very long time. As the train rattled back towards my gilded cage, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a steely determination. I was walking back into the lion's den, but now I had a spear. By the time Christmas decorations started appearing in the shops, I had a formidable archive of their cruelty. I had recorded them mocking my grief. I had recorded them planning how they would spend the money from my house sale, a new car for Oliver, a kitchen extension for Chloe. I had even recorded Chloe going through my private letters, looking for bank statements. They were getting bolder, more careless, convinced I was deaf, dumb, and blind to their machinations. The subtle physical abuse was becoming less subtle.
A shove in the hallway that was a little too hard. A grip on my arm that left finger-shaped bruises. I photographed each one in the privacy of the downstairs loo, the harsh fluorescent light showing the ugly purple and yellow marks in stark detail, and I uploaded the images to the file. I was living on a knife edge, a double agent in my own life, but I knew I couldn't continue indefinitely. The strain was becoming unbearable. I needed one final, undeniable piece of evidence. I needed them to cross a line they could never, ever uncross. I needed evidence of a physical assault that could not be dismissed as an accident. I didn't know how or when it would happen, but I knew with a chilling certainty that it was coming, and I would be ready. The week before Christmas, a brittle, festive cheer descended upon the house. Chloe had decorated with a vengeance, draping every available surface in tasteful silver and white, turning their minimalist home into a sterile winter wonderland. The scent of pine from a real Christmas tree, a monstrous thing that dominated the living room, mingled with the cloying aroma of her scented candles. It was a picture of domestic bliss, a perfect, hollow lie. The tension, however, was anything but festive. It was a low hum beneath the surface of their forced smiles and saccharine pleasantries. They were growing impatient. My continued existence in their spare room, my failure to simply dissolve and leave them my assets, was clearly beginning to grate. I could feel their frustration mounting, a pressure building behind a dam that was about to burst. The day it happened was a Friday. I was in the kitchen, making myself a cup of tea, the simple, quiet ritual, a small act of rebellion in their tightly controlled house. The pen recorder was in my cardigan pocket, a familiar, reassuring weight. It had become a part of me, my unseen witness. Chloe came home from what she called her workout, 2 hours at a nail salon, followed by coffee and gossip with her equally vacuous sister. She swept into the kitchen like a minor hurricane, her face a mask of thunderous discontent. Her eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, landed on the single teacup I had left by the sink, waiting for the kettle to boil. "Why are there always dishes in the sink?" she demanded. Her voice wasn't just annoyed, it was sharp enough to cut glass. It was the voice of someone looking for a fight, for any excuse to unleash the poison that was bubbling inside her. "I was just about to wash it, dear," I said, my voice deliberately mild, my movements calm. I reached for the cup. "Don't," she snapped, her hand shooting out to block me. "Just don't. You can't do anything right, can you? You leave messes everywhere. You use up all the hot water. I am sick to death of living in my own house like I'm the guest." The tirade was ugly, vicious, and entirely for my benefit. I could see her working herself up, her breathing quickening, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. I had to keep her talking. I had to get this on record. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have shrunk away? Or would you have stood your ground, knowing the danger? "Chloe," I said, my voice carefully measured, a perfect imitation of a frightened but placating old woman. "I'm so sorry if I've made you uncomfortable. Perhaps we should sit down and talk about—" "Talk?" She let out a laugh, a high, sharp, humorless sound that scraped against my nerves. "I am done talking. I am done pretending that this is working for any of us." And then she moved. She grabbed my arm, her fingers clamping down just above my elbow like a vice. The strength in her grip was shocking. I gasped, a genuine, involuntary reaction to the sudden, sharp pain. I tried to pull away, but her hold was iron. "You're hurting me," I said, my voice clear and steady, each word a carefully placed piece of evidence for the tiny microphone in my pocket. "I am I?" she smeared, squeezing harder. Her face was close to mine now, her eyes blazing with a vindictive fury. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just being dramatic. Again." Her acrylic nails dug into my skin through the thin wool of my cardigan. The pain was intense, a burning, crushing sensation, but I forced myself to remain calm. My nurse's training kicked in. Assess the situation, document the injury, stay in control. This was the evidence I needed. This was the line being crossed. "Please let go of me," I said, my tone firm, my words precise. "Or what?" she taunted, her voice low and menacing. "You'll tell Oliver? You'll call someone? Who is going to believe a confused old woman over his wife? Who's going to take your side against us?" It was then that I made a mistake, a small, almost imperceptible one, but a mistake nonetheless. I met her eyes, and for a fraction of a second, she saw past the mask. She didn't see fear or confusion. She saw calculation. She saw the cold, clear focus of the woman who had been documenting her every move for months. Her grip loosened slightly. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "What's that look supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly wary. I tried to recover, to soften my expression back into one of harmless fragility. "Nothing," I said quickly. "I just want us to get along, Chloe. I don't want any trouble." But it was too late. The seed of suspicion had been planted. Her eyes narrowed, scanning my face, my clothes, searching for something that felt wrong. And then, with a sudden, dawning horror, her gaze dropped to my cardigan pocket, to the sleek black pen clipped neatly inside. "You're recording this?" she whispered, the words a puff of disbelief. Her face went pale, a sickly, chalky white beneath her expensive foundation. Before I could react, her hands were on me, patting me down, her movements frantic and rough. She was searching for a wire, a phone, anything. "I knew it," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. Her fingers closed around the pen. She ripped it from my pocket and held it up between us, a small, black piece of plastic that held the power to destroy her. She stared at it, her mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. And then she found her voice. "Oliver!" she screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the silent house. I heard his heavy footsteps pounding down the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his tie loosened, his face etched with confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his gaze flicking between his raging wife and my own carefully neutral expression. Chloe held up the recorder like a trophy, her hand shaking. "Your mother," she spat, her voice venomous. "She's been recording us. She's been spying on us in our own home." The color drained from Oliver's face as he stared at the small device. He looked from the pen to me, and I saw the sequence of emotions play out in his eyes. Confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally a surge of cold, terrifying anger. The mask was gone. The charming, concerned son had vanished, and in his place was the monster I had been listening to for months, and he was looking right at me. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Oliver took a step towards me. His eyes, the same blue eyes I had gazed into as I rocked him to sleep as a baby, were now cold, flat, and utterly devoid of recognition. The man looking at me was a stranger, and he was terrifying. "Mom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what is this?" There was no point in lying. The evidence was literally in Chloe's trembling hand. "It's a recorder," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "How long?" he asked, the words clipped. "How long have you been recording us?" I could have tried to minimize it, to spin a story, to plead confusion, but looking at their faces, twisted with a rage that was rapidly curdling into something far more menacing, I knew that the time for pretense was over. My life as a spy was finished. My life as a survivor was about to begin. "Since November," I said. "November?" Chloe's voice was a shocked whisper. "You've been recording us for over a month?" "Yes," I said. I looked from my son to his wife, these two people who had so expertly dismantled my life, who had treated me not as family, but as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. "I wanted to understand who you really are." That was when Oliver moved. He moved faster than I would have thought possible, closing the distance between us in a single, predatory stride. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers biting into the delicate skin, and twisted. A sharp, electric shock of pain shot up my arm, and I cried out, an involuntary, high-pitched sound of agony. With his other hand, he snatched the recorder from Chloe's grasp. "You ungrateful bitch," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and sour with rage. "After everything we've done for you, after we opened our home to you, changed our entire lives to take care of you, this is how you repay us?" His grip was cutting off the circulation to my hand. My fingers were beginning to tingle, to go numb. The pain was nauseating, a white-hot wave that threatened to overwhelm me. But through the haze of agony, one thought remained crystal clear. This is it. This is the moment. Do not break. "Oliver, you're hurting me," I gasped. "Am I?" he sneered, twisting my wrist harder. I felt a sickening pop, and the world went gray at the edges for a second. "You are going to tell me where the rest of the recordings are. You are going to delete every single one. And then you are going to apologize for violating our trust." "And if I don't?" I managed to choke out. "If you don't," he said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "I will have you declared mentally incompetent. I will tell everyone you've been having paranoid delusions, recording imaginary conversations, making up stories about abuse. Who do you think they'll believe, Mum? A successful businessman and his respectable wife, or a confused old woman living in their spare room?" Chloe, her initial shock now replaced by a vicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes, nodded eagerly. "We've been keeping notes, Eleanor," she chimed in, her voice dripping with malice. "All those times you seemed confused, all those conversations where you repeated yourself. It's amazing what friends will remember when you ask them to help protect a vulnerable elderly person from herself." They had it all planned out, a perfectly constructed narrative of my decline, supported by a chorus of their lying friends. If I exposed them, they would destroy my credibility and seize control of my life anyway. If I didn't, they would continue to bleed me dry until I was no longer useful. It was a perfect trap. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had forgotten who I was. I wasn't just a confused old woman. I was a nurse who had spent 30 years on the front lines, helping doctors and social workers build cases against people just like them. I knew their playbook because I had helped to write the counter-strategy. And I knew that abusers always get overconfident. "Okay," I whispered, letting my body sag, my expression crumple into one of defeat. "You win. I'll delete them." Oliver's grip loosened fractionally. He said, "Where are they?" "On the recorder," I said, my voice trembling convincingly. "And on my phone." "Get your phone," he commanded.
With my free hand, the one that wasn't being crushed in his grip, I slowly pulled my mobile from my other cardigan pocket. My fingers, clumsy with pain and fear, fumbled with the screen. I was pretending to look for the audio files, my face a mask of panicked concentration. But what I was actually doing was opening my text messages. My thumb hovered over a pre-written draft addressed to 2 numbers I had programmed in weeks ago. "It's taking too long," Chloe snapped impatiently. "I'm not very good with this technology," I mumbled, a lie that was now second nature. "I'm trying to find the right app." My thumb pressed down, send. The message, just 4 simple words, vanished into the ether. I immediately deleted the evidence of it ever having been sent. Then I brought up a folder on my phone containing a few test recordings of myself reading out a shopping list. "Here," I said, holding it out to them. "But I should tell you, there's a backup system." Oliver snatched the phone from my hand. He didn't even bother to listen to the files, just deleted the entire folder with a single angry swipe. "Where's the backup?" he demanded. "In the cloud," I said, my voice small. "It uploads automatically. I don't know how to delete things from there." That was when Chloe finally lost what was left of her self-control. Her hand flew out and she slapped me hard across the face. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and I tasted the sharp, coppery tang of blood as my teeth cut into my lip. "You stupid old woman!"
She screamed, her face contorted with rage. "How dare you? How dare you spy on us and then try to threaten us?" Oliver stared at her, a flicker of shock in his eyes at the sudden escalation. "Chloe, no," he started. But she was beyond reason now, completely unhinged. "I'm sick of tiptoeing around her," she shrieked, turning on him. "She's been recording us for months, Oliver, planning to use it against us." She turned back to me, her eyes wild, and this time she hit me with her closed fist, a hard, sickening thud to my stomach that knocked the air from my lungs. I doubled over, gasping for breath, and she grabbed a handful of my hair, yanking my head back up with brutal force. "Delete the backup files," she snarled, her face inches from mine. "Figure out how to delete them, or I swear to God I will make you sorry you ever set foot in this house." What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the text message I had sent was already working its magic. The 2 separate messages had been delivered, one to my doctor, Dr. Sharma, the other to my solicitor, Marcus Carter. The emergency plan was active. Help was on the way. They thought they had me trapped. They thought they had all the power. They had no idea that the walls of their own home were about to come crashing down around them. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed Chloe's threat, we all heard it. The sound of the doorbell cut through the toxic atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. We all froze. Chloe's hand was still tangled in my hair, her knuckles white. Oliver stood paralyzed, his face a ghastly shade of pale, the stolen recorder clutched in his hand. For a single, stretched-out second, the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. "Who could that be?" Oliver whispered, his voice cracking. "We're not expecting anyone," Chloe hissed back, her eyes darting towards the front of the house, then back to me, wide with a dawning, panicked realization. The bell rang again, longer this time, followed by a heavy, authoritative knock that seemed to shake the entire house. A man's voice, amplified and impersonal, called out, "Police, open up." If I hadn't been expecting it, the shock might have been as profound as theirs. As it was, I had to fight to keep the wave of relief from showing on my face. I kept my expression neutral, my body limp in Chloe's grasp, playing the part of the terrified victim to the very end.
Because even though I had summoned them, seeing my plan leap from the abstract into terrifying reality was a shock to the system. Police? Oliver's voice was barely a squeak. Why would the police be here? The knocking grew more insistent, rattling the door in its frame. "This is Constable Davies from the Metropolitan Police. We're conducting a welfare check. Please open the door." Chloe's eyes locked onto mine, and in their depths I saw the final pieces click into place. "You," she breathed, her grip on my hair tightening reflexively. "I couldn't have," I said, and it was the truth. "You have my phone." "Open the door immediately, or we will be forced to enter," the voice from outside commanded. The panic in Oliver's eyes was incandescent now. He looked from me to Chloe, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "What do we do?" he pleaded. Chloe, to her credit, recovered first. The raw panic in her eyes was replaced by a grim, calculating resolve. "We answer the door," she said, her voice low and firm. She finally let go of my hair and began to smooth down her own clothes. Her transformation from violent abuser back to concerned daughter-in-law shockingly fast. It was impressive in a truly monstrous way. She leaned in close, her breath hot against my cheek. "And you," she whispered, her voice a venomous promise, "are going to back up our story. You had a fall. You got confused. If you try to tell them anything else, I promise you, you will regret it for the rest of your very short life." The threat hung in the air, as real and as ugly as the taste of blood in my mouth. Oliver, taking his cue from her, walked on unsteady legs towards the front door, Chloe a half step behind him. I could hear their voices shift as they approached the entryway, becoming warmer, laced with a plausible, surprised concern.
"Officers?" Oliver's voice, the smooth salesman's charm kicking in on pure instinct. "Is everything all right?" "Sir, we received a call regarding a possible domestic disturbance involving an elderly resident at this address." A domestic disturbance? Chloe's voice, a masterpiece of shocked innocence. "Oh my goodness, no! There must be some mistake. My mother-in-law lives with us, but she's been a little frail recently." "Is she here now, ma'am?" the officer asked. "Yes, she's in the kitchen. She had a bit of a fall earlier, poor dear. She's very confused." I heard their footsteps approaching and quickly glanced at my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. My lip was swollen and split, a vivid, angry red. The marks on my arm were already beginning to darken into what would become spectacular bruises. I looked exactly like what I was, a victim. 3 police officers entered the kitchen. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind, steady eyes. Behind him was a woman, older than me, with short, gray hair and a gaze that took in my split lip with a sharp, professional assessment. The third was a younger officer, already taking notes in a small black book. "Ma'am," the first officer said, his voice gentle, "I'm Constable Davies. We received a call expressing concern for your welfare. Can you tell me your name?" "Eleanor," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "And are you hurt, Mrs. Thompson?" From the doorway, I could see Oliver and Chloe hovering, their faces masks of anxious concern. Chloe's eyes were locked on mine, a silent, screaming warning. This was the moment, the culmination of months of fear, planning, and endurance. Everything depended on what I said next. My entire future hinged on whether I had the courage to see this through, to trust the system I had so carefully prepared. I looked at the officer's calm face, at the female officer's knowing gaze, and then at my son. And I made my choice. "Yes," I said, the word a quiet exhalation of truth. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The officers exchanged a look. The woman, WPC Hughes, stepped closer to me, creating a subtle physical barrier between me and the doorway. Constable Davies turned to face Oliver and Chloe.
"Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait in the living room while we speak with Mrs. Thompson privately." "Now, wait just a minute," Oliver started, his sales voice kicking in automatically. "This is our house, and that's my mother. This is just a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, sir," WPC Hughes, her voice firm, cutting him off mid-sentence. "This is a welfare check on a vulnerable adult. We need to speak with her alone. Please wait in the living room. Now." The barely veiled command in her voice finally broke through their arrogance. They retreated, casting furious, panicked glances over their shoulders.
As soon as they were gone, Constable Davies pulled out a small digital recorder, ironically similar to the one my son had taken from me. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice all business now, "we're going to record this conversation for everyone's protection. Is that all right with you?" "Yes," I said. "Can you tell us what happened to your face and your arm?" I took a deep breath, the first truly free breath I had taken in months. And for the first time since I had walked into this house, I began to tell the truth. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of an ambulance, a paramedic gently examining my injuries. Through the open doors, I could see Oliver and Chloe being questioned separately on their own driveway, the flashing blue lights of the police cars painting their faces in strobes of red and blue. Chloe was gesturing wildly, her voice rising in a defensive screech. Oliver was trying to maintain his calm, reasonable tone, but I could see the sweat stains spreading under the arms of his expensive shirt. And then, like an avenging angel appearing out of the darkness, a car pulled up, and Dr. Sharma got out. She marched straight over to W.P. Hughes, her face a mask of grim determination. "I'm Dr. Sharma," she announced. "I'm Eleanor Thompson's GP. She sent me an emergency text. I'm here to see my patient." The final piece of my plan had just clicked into place. The trap had been sprung. And my son and his wife had no idea of the hell that was about to rain down upon them. The inside of the ambulance was a small, brightly lit world of calm efficiency. A paramedic named Tom, with kind, tired eyes and hands that were surprisingly gentle, cleaned the cut on my lip while he asked me questions in a low, soothing monotone. He photographed my injuries, his phone's flash a series of small, startling explosions in the quiet space. Each click was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall I was building between myself and my son. We arrived at the local NHS hospital, the familiar chaos of the A&E waiting room a strange comfort after the suffocating quiet of Oliver's house. I was triaged, wristbanded, and wheeled into a cubicle. The process was impersonal, methodical, and for that I was grateful. I had spent months drowning in the turbulent emotions of my family. The detached professionalism of the hospital staff was a lifeline. A doctor, young enough to be my grandson, examined my arm, his touch clinical as he dictated his findings to a nurse. Significant bruising to the upper right arm, consistent with forceful gripping, laceration to the lower lip. Have you ever had to describe your own pain to a stranger, to turn your trauma into a neat, tidy report? It's a bizarrely clarifying experience. You strip away the emotion, the betrayal, the fear, and you are left with the cold, hard facts of the damage done. Dr. Sharma arrived while I was waiting for an X-ray, sweeping into my cubicle like a force of nature. She didn't fuss or coddle, she spoke directly to the junior doctor, her authority immediate and absolute. She confirmed my medical history, my mental state, and the safety protocol we had arranged. I saw the young doctor's expression shift from polite concern to a dawning, serious respect. The narrative Chloe and Oliver had so carefully constructed of the confused, paranoid old woman was being dismantled piece by professional piece. Detective Morrison arrived next, a tall, rangy man in a rumpled suit who looked as if he'd seen every possible flavor of human misery and was surprised by none of them.
He introduced himself quietly and waited patiently while the radiographer confirmed there were no fractures, only deep tissue damage. Then, with Dr. Sharma present as my witness and advocate, he began to take my formal statement. It was as I was recounting the events of the evening that my solicitor, Marcus Carter, appeared at the curtain. He was holding a tablet, his expression grim but resolute. "Detective Morrison," he said, nodding to the officer. "Marcus Carter, I'm Mrs. Thompson's solicitor. I believe my office has already forwarded you the relevant documentation." The detective's eyebrows shot up. "The documentation package?" he asked, a hint of dry amusement in his voice. "Yes, it just came through. 47 audio files, 36 photographs, and a detailed report. Your client has been very thorough." That's the thing about digital evidence, isn't it?
Once it's out there, once you press send, it can't be taken back. It can't be threatened or bullied or gaslighted into silence. A lesson my son was about to learn the hard way. The rest of the night passed in a blur of medical procedures and legal formalities. My arm was put in a sling to immobilize it, my lip was stitched, and with every form that was filled out, with every statement that was taken, I felt another layer of their power over me being stripped away. By dawn, I was officially discharged. The thought of where to go next was a terrifying void. I couldn't go back to their house. The idea of a hotel, anonymous and soulless, felt unbearable. It was Dr. Sharma who asked the simple, obvious question. "What about your own house, Eleanor? You never sold it, did you?" My house. The words echoed in my mind. It hadn't felt like my house since David had died. It had been a museum of my grief, a property to be wrangled over. But suddenly, the thought of it, of my own bed, my own chair, my own quiet space, was the most beautiful thing I could imagine. "It's still hers," Marcus confirmed, "and the first thing we're doing is changing the locks." Marcus drove me home from the hospital. As we turned into my street, the familiar cherry trees lining the pavement bare against the gray morning sky, my heart began to pound. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and a little neglected. A layer of autumn leaves was plastered to the front steps, and a single porch light I'd left on months ago was still burning, a tiny, futile beacon. But it was mine. A locksmith was waiting for us, a cheerful man who seemed entirely unfazed by the early hour and the grim-faced solicitor at my side. As he worked, drilling out the old lock on the front door, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. He was physically removing their access, their entitlement, their invisible claim on my life. Marcus did a quick sweep of the house to ensure nothing had been disturbed. It was exactly as I'd left it, a time capsule of my old life. David's reading glasses were still on the bedside table, his favorite mug was still by the sink. The locksmith finished his work and handed me a set of new, shiny keys. "There you are, love," he said, "safe as houses." The simple, common phrase struck me with the force of a revelation. Safe. I was finally safe. Marcus reviewed the next steps with me before he left. Oliver and Chloe had been formally charged with assault and elder abuse. They would likely be released on bail later that day, but he had already filed for an emergency restraining order. They were not to come within 500 feet of me or my property. After he was gone, I stood alone in the hallway of my own home for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The silence was absolute. There were no whispers, no heavy sighs, no footsteps I had to be wary of. The air smelled of old books and beeswax, and the faint, lingering scent of David's pipe tobacco. I walked into the living room and lowered myself carefully into his armchair by the window. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, watery light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had done it. I had won. I had won. But as I sat there in the quiet, empty house, a new, cold thought began to creep in. This was not the end. This was just the end of the beginning, and I had no idea what horrors the next chapter would bring. The first few days back in my own house were strange and disorienting. The silence I had craved now felt cavernous, amplifying the grief I had suppressed for months. Every object was a memory, every room a ghost. I found myself walking on eggshells, a habit learned in my son's house that was proving hard to break. On the Sunday, my sister Linda called from her home in Spain. I had been putting it off, dreading the drama, the questions, the well-meaning but ultimately useless outrage. I sat in David's armchair, the new keys to my front door on the table beside me, and I told her everything. The manipulation, the abuse, the recordings, the arrest. There was a long, crackling silence on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with a cold, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any shouting would have been. "I'm booking a flight, Eleanor. I'm getting on the next plane." "Don't," I said, surprised by my own firmness. "I need to do this myself, Linda, but thank you." We talked for over an hour, and for the first time since David's death, I felt the simple, uncomplicated comfort of family. The news of the arrest traveled through my quiet, suburban street with the speed of a lit fuse. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher with an encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood's comings and goings, called under the pretense of asking about my rosebushes. She had seen the police cars, of course. She had seen Oliver and Chloe being led away in handcuffs. I was vague, but she was a woman who could read between the lines. "You call me if you need anything, dear," she'd said, her voice full of a fierce, unspoken loyalty. Anything at all. It was a small kindness, but it felt monumental. On Monday morning, my new, quiet life was shattered by the ring of the doorbell. Through the peephole, I saw a woman with a microphone and a man with a large camera on his shoulder. They were from a local news channel. My heart sank. This was the one thing I hadn't prepared for, the public gaze. My first instinct was to hide, to pretend I wasn't home. But then I thought of all the other Eleanors, the other quiet, invisible women being slowly erased in spare rooms across the country. I thought about how close I had come to disappearing completely. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and invited them in. The reporter, a woman in her 50s with intelligent, empathetic eyes, didn't want sensationalism. She wanted to talk about the warning signs, about the insidious nature of financial and psychological abuse by family members. She asked me what advice I would give to someone in a similar situation. "Trust your instincts," I said, looking directly into the camera's unblinking lens. "Document everything. Tell someone you trust, a doctor, a solicitor, a friend. Do not let them isolate you. Your silence is their most powerful weapon." The interview aired that evening. My phone began to ring before the segment had even finished. Linda called, her voice thick with pride. Mrs. Peterson called to say she'd recorded it for her book club. But it was the call from a number I didn't recognize that stayed with me. It was a woman named Carol from a town 20 miles away. "I saw you on the television," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My daughter, she and her husband, they want me to sell my house. They say they're worried about me living alone." We talked for 20 minutes, and her story was a chilling echo of my own. "You've made me realize," she said at the end of the call, "that I'm not being selfish by saying no. I'm being sensible." Hanging up the phone, I realized that speaking out, as terrifying as it had been, was the right thing to do. My story was no longer just my own. It was a warning, a lifeline thrown out into the darkness for others. Have you ever found strength in sharing a painful truth? It's a strange paradox, how speaking about our deepest vulnerabilities can become our greatest source of power.
The next day, Detective Morrison called with an update. "They're looking to make a plea bargain, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "Your evidence is overwhelming. The recordings, Dr. Sharma's testimony, the medical reports, their solicitor knows they don't have a leg to stand on." It was a victory, of sorts. It meant I likely wouldn't have to face them in court, wouldn't have to endure a lengthy, drawn-out trial. But it felt hollow. A few months in prison for what they had done, for the years they had stolen from me, for the son they had turned into a monster. It didn't feel like justice. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sterile conference room at the courthouse for the plea hearing. I watched them walk in, flanked by their solicitor. Oliver wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face pale and drawn. Chloe, however, shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, her eyes burning with a venom that chilled me to the bone. There was no remorse there, no regret, only fury at having been caught. They mumbled their guilty pleas to the charges of assault and elder abuse. The judge, a stern-faced woman who looked at them with open contempt, handed down their sentences. 18 months for Oliver, 12 for Chloe. With good behavior, they would be out in less than a year. As we were leaving the courthouse, a crowd of reporters shouting questions, Detective Morrison called me aside. He had a look on his face I hadn't seen before, a kind of grim, reluctant pity. "There's something else, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low. "During the investigation, we executed a search warrant on their house. We found some things that weren't directly related to this case, but I think you need to see them." He handed me a large brown manila envelope. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with a significance I couldn't yet understand. "Your solicitor has copies of everything."
But I thought you should see this for yourself. I waited until I was home, until the door was locked and the chain was on, before I opened it. I sat in David's armchair, the pale afternoon light slanting across the room, and I tipped the contents onto the coffee table. They were photocopies, financial documents, insurance policies, and a series of emails that made my blood run cold. But it was the last document that made me sit down hard, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged gasp. It was a copy of my will, the one David and I had made together years ago, leaving everything to our only son, Oliver. Scrawled in the margins, in my son's familiar, sloping handwriting, were a series of calculations, asset valuations, and a single, chilling handwritten note. It was a question posed to an unknown party, a question that would change everything. It said, "How do we expedite the inheritance process?" The day of the plea hearing was a study in gray. A gray sky hung over the city, the air was a damp, gray chill, and the courthouse itself was a brutalist monolith of gray concrete. I sat in a small, airless conference room, my solicitor, Marcus Carter, at my side, and waited. I felt a strange, detached calm, as if I were watching a play in which I just happened to be a character. When they were brought in, the sight of them jolted me back into my own body. Oliver looked diminished. His expensive suit hung on him, his shoulders were slumped, and he refused to meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the linoleum floor. He was a ghost of the confident, charming man who had so expertly dismantled my life. Chloe, however, was a different story. She walked in with her head held high, a sneer twisting her perfectly painted lips. When her eyes met mine, they were filled with a venom so pure, so undiluted, it was almost breathtaking. There was no remorse in that look, no flicker of regret. There was only the raw, seething fury of a predator who had been outsmarted by its prey. The proceedings were a formality, a dry recitation of legal jargon that felt entirely disconnected from the raw emotional violence I had endured. They mumbled their guilty pleas to the charges of assault and elder abuse. I listened to the agreed-upon facts of the case, my own trauma reduced to a series of bullet points.
the psychological manipulation, the financial pressure, the physical altercation. The judge, a stern-faced woman with tired, intelligent eyes, looked at them with an expression of undisguised contempt. She spoke of the despicable betrayal of trust, the calculated cruelty of their actions. Then she handed down their sentences. 18 months in prison for my son, Oliver, 12 months for his wife, Chloe. 18 months, 12 months. The numbers echoed in the silent room. With good behavior, they would be out in less than a year. It was a victory, I suppose. They were being punished. They would have criminal records. But as the guards led them away, Chloe casting one last hateful glare over her shoulder, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a slap on the wrist, a paltry, insufficient price for the demolition of a family, for the theft of my peace, my security, my son. As we left the courthouse, we were met by a small scrum of local reporters, their cameras flashing, their questions a barrage of noise. Marcus shielded me, guiding me through the chaos towards his waiting car. It was then that Detective Morrison appeared at my elbow, his expression grim. "Mrs. Thompson, a word," he said, his voice low. He led me to a quiet corner of the car park, away from the prying eyes of the press. He looked uncomfortable, a man tasked with delivering a message he would rather not. "There's something else," he said, "something you need to know." He told me then about the search warrant they had executed on Oliver and Chloe's house.
He spoke of financial documents, of insurance policies, of things they had found that didn't fit the narrative of simple opportunistic greed. "We found some things that were troubling," he said, choosing his words with care. He handed me a large brown manila envelope. It was thick and heavy, and it felt cold in my hands, despite the mildness of the day. "Your solicitor has been sent copies of everything," he said, "but I thought you should see this for yourself. I'm sorry." The apology, more than anything else, sent a sliver of ice down my spine. What could be in this envelope that would make a hardened detective apologize to me in a car park? I clutched it to my chest all the way home, the sharp corners digging into my ribs. I waited until I was inside my own house, the door locked, the chains securely fastened, before I dared to open it. I sat in David's armchair, the pale afternoon light slanting across the room, and with trembling fingers I broke the seal. The contents were a collection of photocopied documents. The first was a life insurance policy. It was for my husband, David. The beneficiary was my son, Oliver. The sum was for 200,000 pounds. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. We had never had a policy like this. We could never have afforded the premiums. I looked at the date it was taken out, 3 months before David died. 3 months before his heart, which had been so strong, so full of life, had suddenly, inexplicably, given out. The second document was a series of emails. They were between Oliver and a man who was listed as a private investigator. The subject line of one of the emails was "Accelerating the Timeline." The body of the email was a chilling discussion of eliminating obstacles and the importance of making things look entirely natural. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to grip the arms of the chair to steady myself. Have you ever had a moment where the entire foundation of your reality cracks open, revealing a chasm of horror beneath? It is a feeling beyond description, a terror that hollows you out from the inside. There was more. A credit report on me, run without my knowledge, detailing my assets, my savings, my small private pension. But it was the final document that made the world tilt on its axis, that stole the very breath from my lungs. It was a copy of my will, the simple, straightforward will David and I had drawn up together over a decade ago, leaving everything to our only child, our beloved son, Oliver. But this copy was different. It was covered in annotations, in my son's familiar sloping handwriting.
There were calculations in the margins, valuations of my property, my investments, my jewelry, and at the bottom of the page, a single, chilling, handwritten note was circled in red ink.
It was a question posed to an unknown party, a question that recontextualized everything I thought I knew about my husband's death, about my own near destruction. The note said, simply, "How do we expedite the inheritance process?" The room began to spin. Expedite, eliminate obstacles, natural causes. It wasn't just about greed. It wasn't just about stealing my house. It was about murder. And the horrifying, unthinkable, soul-destroying realization that crashed down upon me in that quiet, sunlit room was that their plan hadn't started with me. It had started with my husband. For a long time, I just sat there, in the silence of my living room, the photocopied pages spread across the coffee table like a tarot reading from hell. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, menacing shadows across the room. My teacup, forgotten, grew cold. My body was frozen, but my mind was racing, frantically, sickeningly, connecting dots I had never even seen before. David's death? It had been so sudden. A massive heart attack, the doctors had said. A terrible tragedy, but not entirely unexpected for a man his age with his medical history. Natural causes. I had clung to that phrase, natural causes, as a life raft in a sea of grief. Now, it felt like the most obscene lie ever told. I thought back to his final weeks, how Oliver had suddenly become so attentive, so present. He had started visiting daily, bringing groceries, offering to manage David's complex medication schedule. "You've got enough on your plate, Mum," he'd said, his voice a soft caress of concern. "Let me take care of this." At the time, I had seen it as the act of a loving, dutiful son. Now, I saw it for what it was, an opportunity. He had been a wolf in sheep's clothing, not just guarding the flock, but poisoning the shepherd. I remembered his insistence on organizing David's pill dispenser, his feigned concern that my husband, in his weakened state, might forget a dose or take too much. He hadn't been preventing an accidental overdose. He had been planning a deliberate one. My first call was to Marcus Carter. My voice, when I finally found it, was a raw, ragged thing I barely recognized as my own. "Marcus," I croaked, "you need to come over. Now." He was there in 20 minutes, his face etched with concern. I didn't speak. I just pointed to the papers on the table. He sat down, his solicitor's mind immediately kicking into gear, reading, absorbing, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to stunned horror. He looked up from the life insurance policy, his eyes wide. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, This suggests they may have been involved in your husband's death." "He didn't just die, Marcus," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "They killed him. My son murdered his own father." The next few days were a waking nightmare. Marcus immediately contacted Detective Morrison, and the case was no longer about assault and elder abuse. It was a full-blown homicide investigation. The world I had so carefully begun to piece back together was shattered into a million pieces. I was interviewed for hours, not as a victim of abuse, but as the widow of a potential murder victim. I had to relive David's last days, not through the soft focus of grief, but under the harsh, fluorescent lights of an interview room. Every detail, every memory, was now tainted, suspect. Oliver's kindness, his concern, his gentle hand on his father. It was all a lie, a monstrous, calculated performance. The investigators were methodical, relentless. They obtained a warrant to exhume my husband's body.
The thought of them disturbing his final resting place was a fresh agony, a violation I could barely comprehend. But I knew it was necessary. I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly. While we waited for the toxicology reports, the police delved deeper into Oliver and Chloe's finances. What they found was a portrait of a couple drowning in debt, living a lifestyle far beyond their means, their lives a precarious house of cards built on credit cards and payday loans. They were desperate, and desperate people, I was learning, are capable of unimaginable things. The investigation uncovered a pattern. It turned out my David wasn't their first victim. They found another life insurance policy, this one on Chloe's elderly grandmother, who had died a year before David. Her death, too, had been attributed to the frailties of old age, natural causes. Financial records showed that Chloe had been her primary caregiver during her final weeks, and that a small inheritance of £9,000 had appeared in their bank account shortly after her death, the exact amount they had used as a down payment on their house. Then they found another, Oliver's uncle, a diabetic who had died 6 months before David. The cause of death had been listed as complications from his illness, but a quiet word with the man's GP revealed that Oliver had taken a sudden, intense interest in his uncle's insulin regimen in the weeks leading up to his death. They've been doing this for at least 3 years, Detective Morrison told me, his face grim during one of our meetings, targeting elderly family members with assets who were vulnerable due to health problems or isolation. He paused, his gaze full of a reluctant pity that I was beginning to hate. And your husband, the new autopsy found traces of digitalis poisoning. Digitalis, a heart medication, a drug that, in small repeated overdoses, would cause symptoms that perfectly mimicked a heart attack, a poison that would be virtually undetectable in a standard toxicology screen, especially in a man who already had a known heart condition. It was the perfect murder, clever, cruel, and carried out by my own son. After your husband died, the detective continued, his voice gentle, did Oliver and Chloe show any interest in your own medications, in your medical care? I thought back to their constant nagging suggestions about me needing help with my pill dispenser, their offers to speak to my doctor on my behalf, their insistence that I needed someone to monitor my health. It hadn't just been about gaining control of my finances. It had been about gaining access to my medication, access to my life. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was Plan B.
If the slow, methodical process of having me declared incompetent hadn't worked, they would have simply moved on to the next phase. They would have murdered me, just as they had murdered David and Chloe's grandmother and Oliver's uncle. The thought that I had come that close to dying, not from neglect, but from a premeditated, cold-blooded plot, left me shaky and nauseated for days. But alongside the terror, another feeling began to take root, a fierce, defiant pride in my own instincts. Something deep inside me had known they were dangerous. Something had warned me not to trust them, to be careful, to document everything. That quiet, persistent voice of doubt, the one I had almost dismissed as grief-induced paranoia, had saved my life. A week later, the new charges were filed. Murder in the first degree, 3 counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud. Their bail was revoked immediately. They were no longer looking at a few months in a low-security prison. They were looking at life. I was sitting in my living room, staring at a photograph of David and a 10-year-old Oliver, their arms around each other, grinning at the camera on a long-ago family holiday. The boy in the photograph was gone. The man he had become was a stranger. And I, the woman who had brought him into the world, was now the key witness in the trial for his father's murder. The trial that would, I prayed, send him to prison for the rest of his life. The months leading up to the trial were a special kind of purgatory. My life was no longer my own. It was a series of appointments with solicitors, barristers, and detectives. I had to go over my story again and again, each retelling a fresh trauma, each question a sharp probe into a wound that refused to heal. My recordings, once my secret weapon, were now evidence, Exhibit A in the Crown's case against my son. The press, predictably, had a field day. They dubbed Oliver and Chloe the suburban killers, and our quiet, tree-lined street was suddenly infested with satellite vans and reporters hungry for a soundbite. They camped outside my house, their long-lensed cameras trained on my front door, turning my grief into a spectacle. I became a prisoner in my own home once more, the curtains drawn, the phone unplugged. Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor, became my lifeline. She would do my shopping, leaving bags on my doorstep in the dead of night. She was a fierce, protective guardian, chasing off reporters with a garden hose on more than one occasion. Her quiet, unwavering solidarity was a small beacon of light in a very dark world. The trial itself was surreal. I sat in the witness box, the courtroom hushed, and told my story to a jury of 12 strangers. I did not look at my son. I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel his hatred burning across the sterile, wood-paneled room, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of meeting my gaze. I focused on the prosecutor, a sharp, intelligent woman who guided me through my testimony with a calm, professional precision. The recordings were played in court. The sound of my son's voice, plotting to have me declared incompetent, filled the silent room. I heard Chloe's contemptuous, dismissive tone as she called me a burden. It was a strange, out-of-body experience, listening to the soundtrack of my own near destruction. The defense tried to paint me as a vindictive, manipulative old woman, a grief-stricken widow who had concocted an elaborate fantasy to punish her son for some imagined slight. But the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records, the insurance policies, the testimony of the private investigator who had turned on them in exchange for a lighter sentence, and, of course, the toxicology reports. The science that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that my husband had been poisoned. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty, on all charges. As the foreman read out the word, over and over, a wave of something that was not quite relief, but a profound and weary finality washed over me. The sentencing took place a week later. I was there, sitting in the front row of the public gallery. I needed to see it through to the end. The judge, his face a mask of grim disgust, sentenced them both to life in prison.
Oliver, for the murders of his father, his uncle, and for the conspiracy to murder me, would serve a minimum of 30 years. Chloe, for her part, in the murders of her grandmother and my husband, received a minimum of 25. Life. The word hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. They would grow old behind bars. They would die in prison. It was justice of a kind. But as I watched them being led away, my son, my only child, his face pale and empty, I felt no triumph. Only a vast, hollow ache. The boy I had loved was gone forever, and in his place was a convicted murderer. How do you grieve for a loss like that? How do you reconcile the memory of the child you raised with the reality of the monster they became? In the aftermath, the world slowly, tentatively, began to return to a semblance of normality. The reporters packed up their vans and moved on to the next tragedy. The phone calls from well-meaning but morbidly curious acquaintances trickled to a stop. I was left alone, in my quiet house, with the ghosts of my past and the uncertain landscape of my future. I started to reclaim my life in small, hesitant steps. I joined Mrs. Peterson's book club. I started volunteering at a local hospice, my nursing skills, dormant for so long, finding a new purpose. I began to work in my garden again, my hands in the soil a form of therapy, coaxing new life from the dormant earth. But the shadow of what had happened was long. I found I couldn't sleep in the bedroom I had shared with David for 42 years. The memories were too sharp, too painful, now irrevocably tainted by the knowledge of how his life had been stolen. I moved into the spare room, the room that had once been my prison, and I made it my own, painting the walls a cheerful sunny yellow. I knew I needed to do something more, something to truly break free from the past. I had spent my life caring for others, for my husband, for my son, for my patients. I had never, not once, truly put myself first. One evening, while sorting through some of David's old papers, I found a travel brochure. It was for a Mediterranean cruise, a trip we had always talked about, one of those someday plans that we had never gotten around to. We had dreamed of seeing the ruins in Athens, of wandering the canals of Venice, of watching the sunset over the Greek islands. Someday had never come for him. I looked at the glossy pictures of sparkling blue water and ancient, sun-drenched cities. And in that moment, a new, radical idea began to take root. Why did it have to be someday? Why couldn't it be now? The next morning, I called a travel agent. My voice was steady, my resolve firm. I'd like to book a cruise, I said, for one. It was the most selfish, the most extravagant, the most defiant thing I had ever done. It was the first day of the rest of my life.
And as I put down the phone, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, a feeling I thought had died with my husband, began to bubble up inside me. It was a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy. 6 months after my son was sentenced to life in prison, I was standing on the deck of a cruise ship, the warm Mediterranean breeze on my face, watching the sun bleed crimson and gold into the Aegean Sea. The ship's horn sounded, a low, resonant call that echoed across the water, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, my shoulders relaxed. I was a world away from the gray courtrooms, the flashing cameras, and the suffocating weight of my old life. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been therapy sessions that left me raw and exhausted. There were nights when I woke up screaming, the phantom grip of Chloe's hand still in my hair. But slowly, painstakingly, I had begun to heal. I had learned that survival isn't a single dramatic event. It's a quiet, daily choice to keep putting one foot in front of the other. This trip was my declaration of independence. It was a promise I was making to myself, that my story would not end with them. My life would not be defined by their evil. I had visited the Acropolis in Athens, stood in awe before Michelangelo's David in Florence, and haggled for spices in the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul. I had eaten wonderful food, drank good wine, and taken hundreds of photographs. I was doing all the things David and I had dreamed of, and while a part of me ached with the sadness that he wasn't there to see it, another, stronger part of me knew that I was living for both of us now. I met other women on that cruise, women who, like me, were traveling alone. We were a quiet sisterhood of survivors. There was Sarah, a retired teacher who had left her husband of 40 years after realizing his gentle concern was in fact coercive control. There was Patricia, a former nurse who had sold her family home and moved across the country after her children tried to have her declared financially incompetent. We shared our stories over dinner, not as tales of victimhood, but as testimonials of resilience. Have you ever found an unexpected kinship with a stranger, a shared understanding that needs no explanation? It's a powerful and healing thing. On my final night at sea, as we sailed back towards Barcelona, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway. "Mrs. Thompson," a familiar, weary voice said. "It's Detective Morrison."
Has something happened? I asked, my heart giving a small nervous flutter. No, nothing's happened, he said. I just wanted to let you know that their final appeal was denied this morning. It's over, for good. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice quiet. We spoke for a few more minutes, a strange, stilted conversation between two people who had been bound together by the worst of circumstances. After I hung up, I stood at the ship's railing for a long time, looking out at the dark, endless sea. It was over. The final legal door had closed. They were a part of my past now, a closed chapter in a book I was still writing.
And I felt nothing. Not joy, not anger, not even sadness. Just a profound and peaceful emptiness. The war was finally, truly over. When I landed back at Gatwick, it was Mrs. Peterson who was there to meet me. I had asked her to, a small but significant step in learning to accept help from people who offered it with no strings attached. She hugged me, exclaiming over my tan, and as we drove home through the familiar rain-slicked streets of South London, she filled me in on the neighborhood news. And that son of yours, she said, her voice carefully neutral as we pulled into my driveway, he made the papers again, a follow-up piece on the trial. They called you a hero, you know, for being smart enough to record everything. I looked at my house, my clean, safe, secure house. The roses David had planted were in full, glorious bloom, a riot of crimson and pink that Mrs. Peterson had tended to in my absence. This was my home. Not a crime scene, not a museum of grief, but a place where I belonged, a place where I was in control. As I unlocked my front door, the new key turning smoothly in the new lock, I realized that this was the true victory. Not the prison sentences, not the newspaper headlines. It was this, the simple, profound act of walking into my own home, a free woman, and knowing that I was safe. I made coffee, and Mrs. Peterson and I sat at my kitchen table for hours, looking at my photographs, me telling her stories of ancient ruins and sparkling seas. It was a simple, normal, domestic scene, and it was the most beautiful thing in the world. This, I realized, was how my new life would be built, not around the people who had tried to destroy me, but around the people who valued me. The small, everyday kindnesses, the shared cups of coffee, the quiet companionship. It had taken me 67 years to learn that lesson. It had taken the ultimate betrayal to teach me to trust my own instincts, to fight for my own survival. But I had learned it well. Sometimes, when I'm working in my garden, my hands deep in the cool, dark earth, I think of them. I think of Oliver and Chloe, growing old in their separate, sterile cells, their world having shrunk to the size of a concrete box. I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel anything at all. They are a ghost story, a bad dream that is finally over. My revenge was not in their punishment. My revenge is in my peace. My revenge is in the taste of a fresh, ripe tomato from my own garden. My revenge is in the laughter I share with a good friend. My revenge is in the joy I feel when I book another trip, another adventure, another chance to see the world that they tried to steal from me. They took my husband. They tried to take my life. But they could not take my capacity for joy. And I choose joy, every single day. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes, you'll know what I mean.